Welcome back to Superbly Said Advanced English Vocabulary and Phrases. What actually happens when, like, a multi-billion-dollar movie studio completely loses its way?
Right. Well, today's vocabulary actually comes from a SpeakDuo lesson. It's titled The Biggest Problem Lucasfilm Created. And we are basically looking at the language of planning, structure, and, well, massive corporate failure.
Yeah, but before we look at the language behind those specific Lucasfilm business decisions, just a really quick reminder, you can head over to SpeakDuo.com to meet new people from around the world. Practicing English on video calls to become more confident with your speaking abilities. Highly recommend it.
Absolutely. And, we're skipping any long introductions today. We want to go straight into these idioms, which are specifically curated for advanced English learners.
I love that. Let's get right into it.
Because as we analyze this lesson on Lucasfilm, a really fascinating pattern emerged. I mean, the language of business strategy and failure in English it's deeply tied to physical survival and like actual bodily harm.
It really is, isn't it? I mean, the stakes in the corporate world are entirely financial, but we talk about them as if our actual lives are on the line.
Exactly.
So I want to keep that survival metaphor running through our entire deep dive today. Let's start at the very beginning of a project's lifespan, right? Making the plan and knowing when to hit pause.
Right, the initial phases.
Yeah, which brings us to our first set of phrases. So we have charting a course, course correcting, and pumping the brakes.
Yeah, so to chart a course, that basically means to proactively decide and plan a direction to follow.
Like drawing a map.
Exactly like drawing a map. When Disney purchased Lucasfilm for $4 billion, they immediately had to chart a course for the Star Wars franchise.
Right.
So this is that initial planning phase. You were setting clear milestones, assigning directors, and deciding on a release schedule.
Okay, so you've drawn the map, but following that map obviously doesn't guarantee success, right?
Yeah.
You realize you are like walking straight off a cliff.
Unfortunately, yes.
And I guess that is where you have to course correct. So to course correct means to change direction or adjust plans after noticing a mistake. But here's my question for you.
Sure.
If a studio charts a course for a trilogy of movies and the fans absolutely hate the second movie, doesn't course correcting midway through just create like a huge mess?
Well, yeah, it often does. And that is actually the core of the Lucasfilm critique in the source. Course correcting is inherently reactive.
Ah, okay.
Right. You take action, the results are poor, so you drastically alter the plan.
Yeah.
The lesson points out that Lucasfilm tried to course correct the narrative of their sequel trilogy in the final movie, to appease angry fans.
Oh, I'd see.
But because it was so sudden, it ended up feeling completely disjointed.
So course correcting means you are still moving, but you're just yanking the steering wheel in a panic.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Is there a better alternative then?
There is, and that alternative is pumping the brakes. To pump the brakes means to ask to slow down or pause before acting rashly. You aren't abandoning your goal entirely.
Right.
And you aren't violently changing direction like a course correct. You are simply pausing to assess the environment.
So the lesson argues that Lucasfilm should have pumped the brakes, delayed the release schedule, and just figured out a cohesive story.
Exactly.
I really love the driving analogy here. Like, if you are driving and you see heavy fog ahead, you tap the brakes, you assess the situation. But if you realize you are driving into oncoming traffic, you course correct.
Right. That nuance is super important.
Let's bring this into a daily workplace context so you can use it. Imagine you are talking to your boss, and a coworker wants to rush a new software update. You might say, let's pump the brakes and review the facts before we decide.
Perfect example.
Or say you are taking the IELTS speaking exam, specifically Part 2. If you're asked about a time a plan failed, you could say, after missing the deadline, our team met and agreed to course correct the schedule.
Spot on. So let's move into how a project is actually held together once that course is charted. This brings us to segment 2, which is building the foundation.
Okay, segment 2.
We have two phrases here that borrow heavily from the physical world again. We have connective tissue and anchor point.
Now, I have to admit, I get a little confused here. Don't both of those phrases basically mean the same thing? Like, they both describe things that hold a project together, right?
They do, yeah, but they function in completely different dimensions.
How so?
Think of an anchor point as a central, incredibly heavy element that other things depend on. It is the solid foundation.
Right.
In the Lucasfilm example, the anchor point was the legacy of Star Wars itself. Characters like Luke Skywalker or Darth Vader.
Ah, so they are massive, established elements that the new movies relied on to draw in audiences.
Exactly. So the anchor point is the weight.
What is the connective tissue then?
So connective tissue refers to the elements that hold separate parts together and make them coherent. Like in anatomy, connective tissue binds muscles to bones.
Okay, yeah.
In a corporate project, it is the horizontal link between different teams. The source material argues that while Lucasfilm had strong anchor points,
Yeah.
the famous characters, they severely lacked connective tissue.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning the directors of the three films were not communicating with each other. There was no overarching story plan linking their work horizontally.
Wait, really? So consider this. Can an anchor point actually become a vulnerability if the connective tissue between the teams is too weak? Like the project still falls apart.
Oh, absolutely. The anchor holds firm, but the pieces attached to it just dissolve and float away. That is the exact mechanism of their failure here.
That makes so much sense. So to use this in everyday business, if you were in that IELTS Part 2 scenario again, you could say, regular communication served as the connective tissue that kept the team aligned.
Yes.
Or if you're talking to a work colleague, you could say, the prototype was the anchor point that guided all our testing and design choices.
Those are excellent examples, which actually brings us to the real anatomy of failure.
Right, because despite good anchor points, things go wrong.
They do.
Yeah.
So how do we describe different types of failure in advanced English? We have three highly visual phrases here: belly flop, death rattle, and knock-on effect.
Okay, so I'll start with belly flop. A belly flop is failing in a really noticeable, often embarrassing way right from the jump. Like we are talking about acute pain.
Yeah, quite literal pain if you're in a pool.
Right. In the business world, a belly flop is an event, like hosting an event hardly anyone attended. Or in the Lucasfilm case, releasing a movie where the box office returns were an immediate disaster.
Anyone who has jumped into a pool and hit the water flat on their stomach knows that feeling.
Yeah.
It is loud, and everyone is staring at you.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with a death rattle. That sounds significantly darker, honestly.
It is a bit grim, yeah.
Well,
Medically, a death rattle is the specific weak sound a person makes right before they pass away.
wow.
In a corporate setting, a death rattle describes the final weak signs before something ends or collapses entirely.
So it's not immediate?
No, the nuance is that a belly flop is a loud, immediate failure. But a death rattle is a slow, quiet fading away.
I see. So a belly flop is the movie bombing on opening night. A death rattle is the customer interest slowly dropping month after month over a few years until the service just shuts down.
That is the perfect distinction. And, neither of these failures happen in isolation. They generate a knock-on effect.
Right, the knockout effect.
A knock-on effect is the indirect consequence that follows from a single event. It's like systemic shock. The belly flop of a movie creates a severe knock-on effect at the studio, leading them to freeze production on several other things.
It's the domino effect.
Exactly.
So if you need to report on a failure to your boss or maybe a colleague, you could say, our marketing idea was a belly flop because it didn't connect with customers at all.
Yep.
Or customer interest was in a death rattle before we closed the service.
Yeah.
And for the consequence, a short delay in the launch created a knock-on effect across all teams, impacting hiring and schedules.
Perfect. And once a company experiences that kind of systemic shock, their psychology changes.
Which takes us to our final segment, motivations and survival. How do past failures dictate future behavior and survival in the corporate world?
Right. We look at cash grabs, being gun-shy, having a false sense of confidence, and the sink-or-swim environment.
Let's start with cash grab. A cash grab is basically doing something mainly to make money, but with very little effort or care.
Right. It's a very cynical maneuver.
Yeah, I've heard gamers use that phrase constantly. They release similar items at higher prices. It was just a cash grab. It destroys consumer trust.
It really does. But then we contrast that with a false sense of confidence. This is an unwarranted belief that things are going well, usually based on early success.
Like releasing one successful movie and thinking you can't lose.
Exactly. And that false confidence blinds a company to underlying structural issues. But what happens after they make a mistake, like a cash grab, and experience a belly flop?
I assume they get scared.
They become gun-shy.
Gun-shy.
Yeah, this means being overly cautious because of a past negative experience. They are paralyzed by fear and avoid taking risks.
Okay, so if a team is gun-shy, they stop innovating. But what does that mean for the individual employees working there?
It means they are left to sink or swim.
Sink or swim.
Right. This means you are forced to succeed or fail entirely on your own without any help or guidance. Because leadership is gun-shy, they withhold support.
Oh, wow. Back to the physical survival metaphor. So if you are asked about a difficult challenge in an IELTS Part 2 exam, you could say, when I started the job, it was sink or swim. I learned quickly, or I fell behind because new hires were given minimal training.
It perfectly paints a picture of a really harsh environment.
All right, so we have covered the entire life cycle of a project, from charting a course to sinking or swimming. Now it is time for the vocabulary quiz to test your attention.
Yes, the nuances between these advanced phrases really make your English sound so much more natural. Let's see how much you absorbed.
Okay, so here are the rules for the quiz. I'm going to ask the question and read. Options A, B, and C. I will repeat the relevant phrase as much as possible to remind you what you are guessing.
That's good.
And remember, feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer. The expert will then give the answer and remind you of the context. Ready? Let's dive in.
Ready.
Question 1. Which sentence uses the phrase connective tissue correctly based on the lesson? Option A. The incredibly skilled medical surgeon unfortunately severed the delicate connective tissue during the operation. Option B. The dedicated laboratory assistant grabbed the highly absorbent connective tissue before wiping the table. Option C. Consistent daily communication provided the vital connective tissue between the highly separated international teams. Again, the phrase is connective tissue. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
Right, so the correct answer is C, connective tissue.
Mm-hmm.
And remember our earlier example about teamwork, where regular communication served as the connective tissue that kept the teams horizontally aligned?
Question 2. Select the context where the phrase pump the brakes is most appropriately used. Option A. The cautious financial director boldly advised everyone to pump the brakes regarding new investments. Option B. The terrified young driver frantically attempted to forcefully pump the brakes navigating the mountain. Option C. The highly experienced bicycle mechanic needed to carefully pump the brakes inside the workshop. The phrase is pump the brakes. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
Well, the correct answer here is A. Pump the brakes means to pause before acting. Just like our example of telling a coworker, let's pump the brakes before approving a big expense to review the facts.
Awesome. Question 3. In which situation does something accurately perform a belly flop figuratively? Option A. The incredibly clumsy, enthusiastic swimmer unfortunately performed a terribly painful belly flop this morning. Option B. The highly anticipated, expensive promotional marketing campaign tragically became a massive, embarrassing belly flop. Option C. The completely exhausted, lazy golden retriever decided to dramatically belly flop across the carpet. The phrase here is belly flop. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The correct answer is B. A figurative belly flop is a loud, immediate failure. This links right back to our example of the marketing idea that didn't connect with customers at all and was a total belly flop.
Question 4. Which response best demonstrates the advanced phrase cash grab? Option A. The deeply disappointed loyal fans instantly recognize the terrible sequel as a cash grab. Option B. The highly aggressive, desperate thief attempted to suddenly execute a violent cash grab tonight. Option C. The extremely excited television contestant successfully completed the highly competitive, exciting cash grab challenge. We're looking for the phrase cash grab. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The correct answer is A. A cash grab is doing something just for money with no effort. Think of the example where users felt releasing similar items at higher prices was just a cynical cash grab.
Question 5. How would a professional accurately use the adjective gun-shy? Option A. The incredibly terrified hunting dog suddenly became entirely gun-shy during the intense winter expedition. Option B. The inexperienced, nervous police recruit was unfortunately quite gun-shy inside the loud shooting range. Option C. Following several massive financial failures, the senior corporate executive predictably grew incredibly gun-shy today. The word is gun-shy. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
Right. The correct answer is C, gun-shy. In business, it means being overly cautious due to past failure, like a team avoiding risks on new proposals because they were gun-shy after a major loss.
Moving right along. Question 6. Which scenario perfectly illustrates an unwanted knock-on effect? Option A. The aggressively loud, continuous knocking created a deeply disturbing knock-on effect throughout the neighborhood. Option B. The surprisingly brief initial shipping delay unfortunately generated a massive, devastating knock-on effect globally. Option C. The incredibly powerful heavyweight boxing champion delivered a terrifying knock-on effect during the championship. The phrase is knock-on effect. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
The answer is B. A knock-on effect is an indirect consequence. Remember our example where a short delay created a knock-on effect across all teams, which ended up impacting hiring and schedules?
Question 7. Which sentence accurately utilizes the advanced phrase sink or swim? Option A. The highly competitive new corporate internship program was essentially a harsh sink or swim. Option B. The deeply terrified young toddler eventually learned to sink or swim inside the pool. Option C. The incredibly damaged heavy wooden vessel would undoubtedly quickly sink or swim tonight offshore. The phrase is sink or swim. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
Your correct answer is A, sink or swim. This is about being forced to succeed alone, just like that IELTS example we discussed where a new hire is given minimal training and just told to sink or swim.
And the final question, question 8. Which of the following statements correctly uses the phrase course correct figuratively? Option A. The highly dedicated university professor urgently needed to perfectly course correct the examination papers. Option B. Facing unexpectedly devastating financial losses, the executive board realized they must rapidly course correct. Option C. The incredibly skilled racing boat captain successfully managed to violently course correct the sailboat. The phrase is course correct. Feel free to pause the podcast here if you need to think about the answer.
So the final correct answer is B. To course correct means to drastically adjust plans after noticing a mistake. Like when our team met and agreed to course correct the schedule after missing a major deadline.
Well done if you got all of those, or, even if you just added a few new phrases to your vocabulary today.
Yeah, absolutely. But before we go, I really want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Oh, please do.
Notice how the language of business failure in English is so deeply tied to physical survival and bodily harm. From literal belly flops and death rattles to sinking or swimming. It reveals just how high stakes the corporate world feels to the people navigating it. It's almost like a physical threat.
That is so true. It really is a jungle out there. Keep practicing, everyone, and we'll see you next time.